The idea that someone was polluting the waters of Christendom wasn't new. As soon as the Christian movement got going, there were numerous groups, like the Gnostics, for instance, who interpreted Jesus' message differently than the prevailing orthodoxy. In addition, there had recently been what was called the Great Schism, dividing the Greek from the Roman churches, and then another Great Schism, which had to do with competing groups. But what you should also know, and should probably be obvious to you, is that they also referenced the same texts. They all were talking about the Bible, especially the New Testament. But what was that? They were still trying to nail that down in the 400s. But they all claimed the same authority of orthodoxy. And there's the rub. According to Edward Peters, heresy did and does not exist in and of itself, but only in relation to orthodoxy. Orthodoxy cannot exist in turn without authority, and it is the quality of authority in orthodoxy that defines and denounces heresy. In other words, one must be the winner, must be on top to effectively define and denounce something that one designates as heresy. And it's important to remember that just as heretics are creations of their antagonists, orthodoxy, something called orthodoxy, only existed in the imagination as the church began meeting in a series of councils over several centuries to define and establish just what it was. But ultimately, creating the identity of heretic and applying it to individuals and groups was all about Roman Catholic power and authority. So just what was Roman Catholic orthodoxy? Well, it was based on scriptures and something that Roman Catholics call tradition. That included the oral tradition, in other words, things not found in the Bible text, for example, local customs that were integrated into the Roman Catholic worldview in order to facilitate conversions. Also, conclusions of various councils like the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Carthage, and so on. There were also creeds in this tradition, which are essentially statements of beliefs. And all of this ultimately developed into a creed for the entire Christian community and eventually imposed upon them, where they had to say, yes, I believe this or I believe that. One of the main issues that we see from the 11th century on is a rejection of sacramentalism in some form. For some dissenters, the issue was priestly authority and the worthiness of priests to perform saving sacraments. And you see this, of course, in the reading that we did this week on the Good Christians. The question was whether or not a sacrament, which the Roman Catholic Church said was absolutely necessary to avoid going to hell. So the question was whether or not that was efficacious, if it was effective, if it was performed by a priest who wasn't living right. So you can see then how Western dualism could appeal to people, because if their priests weren't obviously living right, then they were concerned about the salvation of their soul, and so they could turn to these elect men and women in their communities for those saving ordinances upon their death. For others, the concern with sacramentalism had to do more with people reading the Bible and failing to find the Roman Catholic Church's tradition-based sacraments in it. In fact, the Protestant Reformation and Luther had that as one of its bullet points. Sola Scriptura, Scripture alone. If it's not in there, we reject it. For others, it was the issue of infant baptism, and that's still a point of debate in Christian America. In any case, the Roman Catholic Church claimed exclusive access to all of those saving rites. Therefore, to question those rights in any way was to challenge the Church's authority and authenticity. So the question I want you to be thinking of always, of course, is what was at stake for the heretics? To know how to live like Jesus lived and taught, and how to live an authentic Christian life, in other words. And of course, this was also what was at stake for the orthodoxy, the people in charge of the Roman Catholic Church and those who supported it. They also wanted to live an authentic Christian life, but they saw that essentially as only being able to take place inside the Roman Catholic Church, what the orthodoxy said they should do. So just what was this authentic method? Well, it was the apostolic model, following the apostolic model. The only real authentic Christian life was based on the apostolic model as it was laid out in the New Testament. to live as Christ and his apostles lived, to do what they did. The image here is an Eastern Orthodox example. Based on church tradition and dogma, this likely involved rejection of the world, sexuality, marriage, ownership, and other worldly things. At least that's how they interpret it. But this always implied criticism of the church, and often a complete rejection of church authority and dogma. As R.L. Moore says, the moral authority invoked by living in poverty based on the apostolic model shamed the institution and threatened their power and authority. And so you may be asking, so why was critique dangerous? I mean, aren't we always critical of our churches? Well, there were actually few real heretics, comparatively speaking. So what was the threat perceived by the church, by these small groups of people? Why even bother labeling people heretics? Because their primary mandate, they believed, was to protect and preserve something called Christendom. It was not only the church as an institution, but it was also the civil empire, which was dependent on the church for power and salvation. Even kings needed to have the saving rights in order to go to heaven after their deaths. So it was a sacred entity, valuable above all other entities. And it was supposed to be uniform. Yep, uniform. Good luck with that, right? Undivided, voluntary, loyal, and scripture-based. Well, the voluntary, it's supposed to be voluntary, but of course we'll see that it's not, because if you end up thinking that that people must belong, then it no longer becomes voluntary. But to challenge any of that implied that the church was failing, right? Failing in its primary job of protecting Christendom. Something else was going on during this time period. People were becoming more widely traveled, and so they were encountering new and different people and ideas. The state poses more competition to the church as time goes on. Literacy rates are increasing, and so people are actually being able to read the Bible in their language. And so religious dissent is suddenly more of a concern. It's more of a threat to Christendom. But when the Pope calls for reform, that ends up being a formula for dissent, right? So the reform movement started in the monasteries as a reaction against bloat and corruption. And at the heart of this is always a desire to live a pure, original Christian life. But it was difficult to tell the difference between heretics and Orthodox Christians sometimes because they all looked pious. Ultimately, it was uncontainable, even when the church outlawed lay ownership of Bibles, precisely because in those days, just as now, people wrote their own interpretations in the margins, and much of those individual interpretations were by definition heretical. And dualism, which critiqued the relationship of the material world, was an obvious response to changes taking place, for instance, in Italy, when church authority got restructured, new civic institutions got created, and gender roles available to women narrowed even more. Of course, it's going to break out into new spaces. It erupts into new areas. The places in which the Cathar heresy became a deep problem were decentralized. So they were independent and less connected to institutions of all kinds, both religious and political. There was a perceived clerical decline all around, right? You had Pope Innocent III calling local clerics blind creatures, dumb dogs who no longer bark. But you also had local acknowledgement that there were some problems, though perhaps not to the extent that we're used to thinking of them. But the most important thing was probably the persistence of noble power, because they became unwilling to stop, civil leaders became unwilling to stop protecting the heretics because they were a deep and abiding part of the community. There was also improved local living conditions and local tolerance of other religions and religious innovations. So this local protection from nobility ended up causing an uneven response all around to heresy, depending on one's local political situation. So, why didn't they distinguish between heretics? Yes, they did remind church officials of earlier heretics because of the content of their heresies, that old pesky dualism. But it may not have mattered because of what was at stake. It didn't matter which brand of heretic you were threatening the community. That's what was at stake. And so they developed pejorative terms to distinguish these diverse heretics from what they considered to be the true people of God. So the call for reform that caught like wildfire amongst the local communities was difficult to contain, very much like revivalism is always difficult to contain in any time or place. Some of the strategies that the Roman Catholic Church developed to deal with these heresies, what they consider to be heresies, started with verbal persuasion and instruction with the idea that we can teach them what's correct. They're just mistaken, right? They haven't yet just chosen outright to believe wrongly. They just don't know any better, so we'll tell them what's right. That, of course, developed into violent crusade, the development of new religious orders like the Dominicans and the Franciscans, and also then, of course, inquisitions. And you will see more of that as we go along.